because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science from the Fringe. I'm Bryce Nichols, a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by David Zweig, who is a New York City-based journalist, an author whose articles have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and the Free Press, among other places, where he has challenged mainstream narratives on public health policies implemented during COVID-19. He's also the author of several books, and today we're going to be talking about his most recent book, which is called An Abundance of Caution: American Schools, the Virus, and the Story of Bad Decisions, which came out this past April and is a powerful critique of the misguided public health policies that kept U.S. schools closed for far too long, and has been hailed by certain reviewers as a magisterial contribution that exposes the junk science behind those decisions. You can also follow David by subscribing to his Substack newsletter, which is called Silent Lunch. David, thank you very much for joining me this evening. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, Bryce.
I wanted to, begin by sort of looking at the forests before we get into the trees. So your book, which came out this last April, talks about the public health catastrophes that occurred, or decisions that were essentially catastrophic that occurred in the wake of COVID-19. Can you tell me what prompted you to write the book?
Early on, I lived just north of New York City, and I sort of went along with what everyone else was doing around me in my neighborhood, and kind of was worried about this new virus, and did our locking down and wiping of the groceries and the whole shebang. But very, very quickly, I observed my kids being home from school in what they then became called remote learning, or distance learning. And my kids were in third grade and fifth grade at the time. It was very obvious from day one that this was a disaster. Now, of course, if the people are thinking, well, it's staying home from school or dying, and that was sort of the way that the narrative was cast, that, it was a choice between death, or maybe the kids wouldn't die, but they're going to kill other people. So of course you're just, in the scheme of things, who cares if they're home for a while? Well, I am someone who, I'm always a bit skeptical of everything in life. I have a long history of doing investigative work in the sciences. I'm very familiar with reading studies and with talking with experts in a whole range of areas of endeavor. So, and I have just a skeptical eye about everything. So although I went along with everything in the beginning and wasn't a quote denier or anything like that, as people were called, I was at minimum quite curious about, well, what's the actual evidence going on here? What are the risks, for the general population? What are the risks to children? What is the evidence behind any of these mitigation measures they're attempting to implement? I wanted information, and I felt like I wasn't getting any information, really, anything substantive from the standard media outlets. And ultimately, watching my kids suffering at home, I began to worry very much about them. And then kids around the country, most of whom probably did not have the advantages that my kids had. And I began to wonder, well, what are we doing here? What's the end game on this? It's week 1, then it's week 2, then week 3, then you're, into April. And I'm starting to wonder, well, when does this end? What's going to happen? And that kind of set me on my course, because it was very obvious this was going to be extremely harmful to kids, particularly kids who lacked a lot of resources. And that kind of was what launched me on my path to ultimately becoming, I guess, what was known as kind of probably the most prominent sort of contrarian, so to speak, journalist, at least contrarian who was writing in sort of established legacy media outlets like Wired and later on in New York and The Atlantic and even the New York Times.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I think one of the things, and I told you before we started recording this, that I actually, for those that know me, they know I don't read a lot of books. In fact, I very rarely read books. And I did, in fact, read your book, which I have here, and I found it to be
An
like,
abundance of caution out now.
right, please go get
Yeah.
it. I see I have the hardback
Even
copy
better.
of it,
Yeah.
but hardcover. So so it is a very, very, I guess what I'd say about it, that I really appreciated is that it does blend some of these personal anecdotes, with, it's packed with data and like timelines and a lot of like scientific rigor about how about the science behind what these interventions that were being imposed on the public and what was being said by public health officials in the media. And I think, would it be fair to say that you've achieved a work that not only sort of informs the readers about what went on, but also does a good job of provoking an emotional response, an outrage? I guess, was that one of the intended things that you tried to do with your book?
Well, I would ask you as the reader, was that the effect on you?
For me, it was different, I think, and maybe we'll talk about this more later. It's in a way reading your book and thinking about these issues. In some ways, for me, it evokes like shame and embarrassment because perhaps we haven't discussed it, but I have, publicly talked about it elsewhere. That I was one of the people who was very supportive of the lockdowns when they were implemented and other measures, and it's embarrassing, frankly, to sort of look back and see
Mm.
how misguided that was. So,
Did you find any? So for me, my goal, and this I think sort of answers, I'm going to attempt to answer your question, but my goal is always as a writer to not just preach to the choir, so to speak, but to try to reach people who maybe don't have my view and persuade them with evidence. That's always what I try to do. Um, and it was one of the most rewarding, um, and it's certainly great to have people who are reading the book who already kind of were in agreement with the general thesis, and that's terrific. And I'm so glad for their support. And it's valuable, even if you believe something, to then read if I may, it's published by MIT Press, a scholarly work that then gives you more evidence, behind a thought that you had, but it's like, oh, now I can really understand it on a deeper level. I have all this other information and evidence. So I think it's very, very valuable to read something that supports your view sometimes when it's done in a really kind of academic and scholarly way, although entertaining as well. But with that group of people addressed, who I really want to reach, or what's the most rewarding, is when I can kind of persuade someone who maybe had thought otherwise. And there was a guy who I loosely know who is sort of your standard kind of lefty academic. I think he was at Columbia for quite a while teaching there, and he was very, very much pro. I don't want to say pro lockdown, if that's the right terminology to use, but he was just the standard kind of establishment view, whatever the New York Times and, whoever else was pushing, of like, the narrative is something like, look, we are faced with a deadly virus. We need to do everything we can. You need to listen to the experts. I'm not going to listen to Trump. I'm certainly not going to listen to some internet rando and the bunch of assholes who don't care about people and all they care about is money. Like, that's the kind of like basic narrative. Like, I'm a person who believes in science, and like, I'm going to listen to Anthony Fauci, and I'm going to listen to my, local, pediatrician or whatever. That guy, after he read my book, said that it completely like blew open his world. That he was like, all of his assumptions, everything he thought that was true, was like blown open. Um, that's my dream. That's like my dream reader for my book. Not everyone is going to be open to that because unfortunately a lot of people aren't persuaded with evidence. A lot of people, their decisions they make are based on emotion, not on facts and evidence. So those people will never be persuaded. But if I can reach whatever that sliver of people in the middle somewhere who do look at evidence and do kind of have an open mind, and are willing to feel embarrassed at maybe having thought the wrong way about something. That's exactly what happens. So that's my goal. I'm curious. I don't know how far along you were, Bryce, in your views, but let me say, I have my own embarrassment to some extent of, early on, like I said, wiping down groceries. And, I, was a full like pro masking person early on because it made intuitive sense to me. Well, of course, if you're wearing a mask, if everyone's wearing masks, that's going to be beneficial. Over time, through reading, looking at the studies, looking at the actual evidence, what are the randomized trials showing, et cetera, I then change my tune. So I have my own sort of, maybe embarrassment is too strong, but I have my own sort of change of view that I went on my own trajectory. So anyway, this is perhaps a little long of the answer to you, but it is interesting to me. And I'm curious sort of like your feeling as you're going through the book, reading, the various sort of examples I give, almost like a series of case studies, I think, how that hit you.
Well, I had already recognized prior to reading your book that I was wrong about these things. This just reinforced. I mean, to your point, I think you have created what I think is a, very like a work of scholarship that could be used to teach classes on the subject and should be used as a resource for people looking back at the mistakes that were made during COVID-19. So I do, historically, I think this is actually a very, important book that in compiling all of the things as you did and meticulously documenting, the science that was happening in real time and the policy decisions that were made. So I appreciate it for sure. And I guess it's good to hear that at least one person, going into the book hadn't been, realized how wrong a lot of the decisions were, and the book convinced them. And I think that's a good point about who the hopeful target audience for this is. But what one, I guess, question that emerges out of what you were talking about in terms of how you were thinking about this early on, is, I guess it's relevant to kind of the language around how we talk about the issue of lockdown. So can you define, as you do in the book, like what you mean by lockdowns or school, like what exactly would you refer to as a lockdown?
Yeah, it's a vague term that doesn't have a definite definition, that everyone's going to agree on. To me, and I think the way I use it in the book, a lockdown is when the citizenry is prevented from exercising its their liberty, to move freely about society and conduct your life as you wish. I mean, in a general sense, that's a lockdown. When you are prevented from gathering with others, when your children are prevented from going to school, when perhaps you are prevented from conducting your work, or people are prevented from coming to your place of business. If you run a mom and pop store and people aren't allowed to come there, or they're afraid to come there, that's a lockdown. Now, my book focuses on school closures, but in order to focus on school closures, um, necessarily that involves all the sort of concentric circles around that, which are the broader sort of mitigation measures, from, adults being compelled to stay home to these various interventions, mask mandates. And in schools, they had barriers, put desktop barriers, these, and I describe it, in the book, my own kids, they had to sit with their heads inside of these cardboard boxes, basically like, when you think of like a voting booth, opaque on the sides. There weren't even, clear plastic on the sides. So you couldn't, it was like horse blinders. I called it. Imagine you just couldn't see any peripheral vision. They had to sit with their heads inside those things all day long in school. Once school reopened and they were in, on a hybrid schedule, a couple days a week. This went on for like a year. So the mask mandates, the desktop barriers, the 6 feet of distancing, which is perhaps the most consequential, because the 6 feet of distancing necessitated that most schools could not be open full time because they had to only have at most half the students there in order to comply with the distancing. That you couldn't have a class densely populated because then you wouldn't be able to have 6 feet of distance between each child. So these and other mitigation measures. I was very interested in looking at, well, what's the actual evidence behind these things? Now, again, anyone who's made it this far listening to this podcast, if any of the people are saying to themselves, well, this was a reasonable course of action. They did the best they could. This is the narrative is, look, mistakes were made, but we did the best we could. We were building the plane as we fly it, is one of the cliches, or it was a fog of war and we had limited information and this made sense. And if there's one thing I can do with the book, it's to show that that is a myth. It is a very convenient and exculpatory narrative to make people feel better about what they did. Now, I don't blame the sort of average citizen, who has a job, that they aren't going to be aware of the data and be aware of the historical literature on this. But I do blame, and most of the ire in my book is and the lens is trained on to two groups, the public health establishment and secondarily the media. Because in my view, both of those groups completely failed catastrophically at doing their jobs. And I show that this happened in real time. That one of the annoying criticisms of my book that is unfounded is that, oh, well, this is a Monday morning quarterback. This is, well, sure, it's easy to look back and no. Almost everything in the book, with a few rare exceptions, almost everything in there is essentially like what we would call like a TikTok, taking you through week by week or month by month. Here is what was known at that time, or here is what was known even before that time in the literature prior to the pandemic. And nevertheless, this evidence, this empirical data that we had was ignored or dismissed for any number of reasons. So it's really, really important for people to understand that the broader sort of story that we were led to believe of like, quote, benign and benevolent, noble sort of public health professionals doing the best they could with limited information is false. And it's really, really hard for people to accept that, but it's true. And I take whatever it is, 450 pages or something, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of endnotes with citations to show why that's not true, that narrative. And, ultimately, this book is not about the pandemic, in my view. Like any good book, I think it's about the thing, but it's about something larger. And what I really am interested in, Bryce, is decision-making. How is it that society, American society, chose to keep millions, it's not a small, millions and millions of healthy children were prevented from attending school, many of whom were prevented from attending school for more than a year? This had never been done before, and there were millions of kids in school as early as the spring of 2020 in Europe with no observable negative consequences. How is that possible? How could it be that millions of kids were in school in Europe and that was ignored, and we were told over and over, month after month, and indeed more than a year later, we can't let our kids in school here. And the harm to them was extraordinary to some of these kids, and we can get into that. So that to me is what animated the book, was trying to understand how sort of human nature works, how does society work, that these types of bad decisions can be made.
And to that point, will you talk about something that you cover in your book, which is relevant to the decision-making that occurred, is certain biases. So can you describe the role of what you refer to as action bias or intervention bias in the decision-making process?
Yeah, I find this fascinating. And, one of the things that I do is that I think is important is I don't spend a lot of time sort of ascribing ill will to anybody, unlike some other critics of the pandemic, and those people may disagree with me. I think by and large, there are a few exceptions, but by and large, the people who are in charge, the health officials and the broader sort of like public health establishment of just kind of doctors more broadly and epidemiologists and whomever else were sort of being interviewed or just talking with their peers and community members, by and large, these people were trying to help. They weren't intentionally trying to harm anyone, of course. I think people who go into public health and who go into medicine, this is a noble cause. They're trying to help people. However, what I talk about is, and there's some really interesting literature on this that I talk about in the book, is that we have a lot of evidence that people in public health have a bias toward intervening, toward believing that the interventions that they impose on us are going to be beneficial, even when they're not. And not only that, there's a good amount of evidence that even after they see and they know that a particular intervention is not effective, they will continue to demand and push that this intervention continue because it feels good to feel like you're doing something. If you go to the doctor and your back hurts, most doctors are not inclined to just say, look, there's nothing I can do about this. I'm sorry. Most doctors, they want to do something, and they're going to, okay, well, let's do a CAT scan. Maybe we need an MRI. Maybe we need to do something, even more intrusive, and start doing more and more tests, that they want to do something. Maybe you'll even have surgery, and on, that there is a bias toward wanting to intervene. It comes from a good place because you don't want to feel helpless. But the harm of that bias is that it also comes with an unearned belief and an unearned optimism, and a dangerous optimism in the likelihood of benefit of these interventions.
The other piece that you cover in your book that's relevant too is this idea that when you implement a policy, so first, as you just said, there are this strong bias to do something. But the other flaw, or that you go over in the book, is the lack of an off-ramp for some of these policies that were implemented. Can you talk about how that influenced some of the bad decision-making?
Yeah, and you're right. You lay it out well. There's sort of like these multiple pieces happening. First, you have the bias to do something, which again, I think comes from a good place, but we need to be aware of this bias to intervene.
Well, David, just to your point, though, the other thing you cover in the book is how that was kind of weaponized, this like moral high ground. So there was
Indeed.
moral grandstanding where the interventions were labeled as morally righteous, and if you opposed them, you were evil and you favored death. So I don't know if it's fully well-intentioned when,
Yeah, that's a
opponents
good
are
point. I'm
labeled.
being a little too generous, perhaps, in how I'm describing it now. But you're right. And I spend plenty of time in the book talking about the sort of maligning of anybody who would disagree. And I know your own, involvement in looking at things with the lab leak and such, that like there are certain accepted beliefs. And if you even ask questions, perhaps challenging this sort of accepted establishment view, you are a piece of garbage. How dare you? Who are you? You're a fool, you're an idiot, and you're a malevolent actor. So you're right. Like there's certainly, I still think perhaps it came from a good place that they were so convinced of their own righteousness and rightness. They were so convinced that they had to sort of enact that this kind of almost like a militant stance that if anybody disagreed, and as we know with all the Great Barrington people, and and I was there at the Great Barrington Declaration, that those people were, quote, bad. Like, how dare they? They are going to cause harm. So there was this whole dynamic where any sort of dissent, any questioning was completely was just completely shut down. It wasn't allowed, and people's careers and social standing were destroyed or attempted to be destroyed if they challenged it. And look, and I was one of those people who certainly took plenty of hits because I had been writing in the quote legacy media for many years. I had published a book before with Penguin Random House, writing for the New York Times and other places like that, and I was kind of the lone voice in those publications who was just completely pushing against what they all thought was an accepted narrative. And make no mistake, I took plenty of heat for it. So I'm well aware of the sort of dynamic. But anyway, getting back to your question, so you have these people who have a sort of action bias or intervention bias. So now they're doing more than because they have an unearned belief in the effect of it. Then what happens is that then persuades and I would say misleads the public into believing hey, we need to do something. We are facing this scary virus, and how dare you want to go to work? How dare you want your kid to go to school? That's too dangerous. You're endangering me. You're endangering others. So there's this whole sort of moral component, and there is a belief system around the benefit or the potential benefit for these interventions. And then, well, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to an inertia where you can't wind down these interventions, even after there's enormous amount of evidence that they don't work, and even more so, evidence that they're harmful. So you have this situation. It's sort of like Newtonian physics. Like once the object is in motion, it stays in motion. It is very hard, and there's a lot of literature. I talk about this in the book. I find it just fascinating. That in implementation science, it's this sort of field within medicine. And there's an infectious disease specialist, physician named Weston Branch Elliman, who I feature in the book quite heavily. At the time, she was at Harvard, and she has a subspecialty in implementation science. She said, look, there's a lot of evidence over the years that when doctors implement a particular treatment plan or a particular intervention, they are just disinclined to stop doing it. You just sort of leave well enough alone, even after there's evidence that it's not beneficial. An example would be this sort of like post-op prophylactic antibiotic use. There's a fair amount of evidence that this isn't beneficial in most instances, and it actually can cause harm. But yet most doctors, or a significant portion of them, continue to do it anyway. You have surgery, you have this automatic post-op, prophylaxis course of antibiotics. Again, I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions where it's appropriate, but she had done research on this and found that they continue to do it anyway, even though the evidence suggested otherwise, that this would be a good course of action. So there's a zillion examples. So anyway, as you know, the term du jour was off-ramp, and there were no off-ramps. They simply said, and Deborah Birx and these other people who kind of were controlling the marionette strings of society, they had no idea, nor did they even give a shit about an off-ramp. It was, we're putting this stuff into motion. We'll deal with everything later. And this was incredibly short-sighted.
Actually, to that point, can you talk a little bit about the Red Dawn emails and what that was and the role that it played very early on in the pandemic?
Yeah, the Red Dawn thing is a really, really interesting component to the pandemic that I think like a fair amount of people probably are unaware of, unless you're like kind of super into pandemic stuff. The average person, but there was an email group called Red Dawn. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek, jokey reference to a movie from a number of years earlier. And this was composed of a number of epidemiologists, physicians, some people at NIH were in there, and various academic institutions. And they were all talking with each other at the very beginning of the pandemic, trying to orchestrate the national response. And some of those members, including most importantly a guy named Carter Metcher, who is involved in the CDC's like what I would call a pandemic playbook, the sort of guidebook about how the government should respond in a pandemic. He was one of the instrumental figures in there. And these people had an extraordinary amount of influence on ultimately what happened in our society. So you have this kind of secret email exchange that ultimately, I think, I suppose it was through a FOIA that ultimately became public. And I give links to it in my endnotes in my book if anyone wants to, go in and actually read the Red Dawn chain. But I quote from it quite extensively as you see this kind of behind the scenes of how these highly influential people were talking about and thinking through how to act. And you also, as I point out extensively in my book, the error in many of the things that they were saying to each other, even though they were saying them with incredible confidence, much of what they believed was totally wrong. And they actually were incredibly ignorant about what a lot of the academic literature, had shown for decades and decades prior to the pandemic.
And I think it's what is that person's name? Carter
Yeah, Carter Metcher, yeah.
I think he's the one that has that quote, like, well, why don't we just do this for 15 days and then we'll check back later and see or something. And then it speaks to this idea that they were kind of like throwing stuff at the wall.
They felt that we were confronted with an extraordinary emergency. And this was, you had to act urgently and you could not worry about, a month down the road, let alone 6 months down the road. We need to just get this stuff in motion now because people are going to die if we don't do this. And again, the harm is, and the quote that I start my book off with from C.S. Lewis is about, the greatest tyranny is when you have someone who believes that they're doing something for your benefit, when it's actually harming you. It's having someone who knows they're doing the bad thing, that's easy. It's far more dangerous when you have someone who feels sanctimonious, who feels certain of their path is correct, and they're actually imposing great harm on you and on others, but it's impossible to stop them because they're convinced they're right. And that's what this, email chain showed. You had this group of people who were quite convinced that what they were doing was necessary. But what they were basing things on was completely bogus. And I get into a lot of stuff in the book, as you know, about modeling, which so much of the response was based on. And the models that much of the response were based upon were bogus. And it's hard to believe this stuff. I think for a regular person, it sounds crazy, but it's true. And one example I could give about why you should be skeptical of the quote experts, who created these models that showed, well, if we do this, and this, then it's going to reduce cases and hospitalizations. If we close schools, it's going to have this benefit. If we make everybody 6 feet apart or stay home, it'll have that benefit. That something like 3 of the top 4 most accurate modelers of cases and hospitalizations, 3 of the top 4 were not even public health professionals. It was a random software consultant in Washington State. It was a physicist in Canada and some management consultant group in the States. They had more accurate models than professionals from places like Columbia, Duke, from the Los Alamos lab, from IHME, which is this famed, public health program at University of Washington, and a variety of others. That you have essentially these like randos who had zero experience in public health, and they were more accurate than the experts who've spent decades, who spent their entire professional careers doing this stuff. Well, hold on a minute. What does that say about the expert class in this? It's hard to find, and this isn't my opinion, by the way. This was a study published, and I think it was in the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences or something. It was in a prestigious journal. This isn't like my opinion on this. This is just fact that the randos were more accurate than the experts because they allowed random people, if you pass certain metrics, that you were allowed to include your models in this sort of ensemble that the CDC looked at. I mean, it's hard to think of a more damning indictment of the expert class within public health than that outcome.
And you propose in your book that the reason for that is sort of a preconceived biases of have become known as the laptop class, right? Like the idea, the reason why the experts were wrong, at least my interpretation, at least I think what you're saying is that their life experience makes them prone to assumptions and putting assumptions in their model that don't turn out to sort of align with reality. Or is that an oversimplification of what your thought is of how the experts missed it?
Well, it's correct, but I would sort of frame it slightly differently. The errors with the models were by and large because it's just models upon models upon models. There's the expression, it's turtles all the way down, or it's a proverbial house of cards, whatever you want to call it, that, you have a model and it's based on, they make some sort of claim about, percentages. And then I look up, well, where'd they get this percentage from? And then the citation is another model. I'm like, well, that's not evidence. A model is conjecture. That's just, a prediction. And then that model is based on a model. And you go down, and it's like 8 layers deep. It's just a model upon a model upon a model. And then finally you get to the thing and there's like nothing there. There's no there. That, one of the citations that I refer to in the book that was at the sort of foundation 8 layers deep under these models, the authors admit and I found it buried in a supplement, that they said, this figure was chosen arbitrarily. So like you have this model at the very top where there's assumptions about what the benefit will be of like closing schools, for example. And you have to go layer upon layer upon layer down until you actually aren't looking at a model anymore, but it's some sort of actual supposedly substantive content. And it turns out they made it up. They said it was arbitrary. That is wild. That's like almost not believable that this is how this stuff is conducted. I can't, you could speak to this because you're a scientist. Like I couldn't believe, I still can't believe that's how science is conducted. It's like almost surreal. It was so bizarre. It was very unmooring finding that piece of information in the supplement that the authors admitted. They said, we've chosen this number arbitrarily. I mean, it's hard to think of a more unstable foundation. So anyway, so that's, I think, the problem with the models is that like scientists, particularly modelers, in my observation, are not really looking at evidence. They are, it's just sort of these things become true in their particular field. And then everyone just builds on this kind of belief that something's true, but no one's actually like, oh, wait a minute, should we actually like click through the citation and see what that's based on? No one bothers. But more broadly, when you think of the laptop class, part of what makes a model problematic is what is chosen to be put in the model to begin with and what's left out. And, the models looked at what, cases and hospitalizations or deaths from COVID, but what they didn't model was, well, what are the harms from keeping a, 13-year-old kid who lives in a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, with a bunch of other people in an unstable home that's dangerous and who's reliant upon school for food and for safety and for a possible, path to the future. What happens to that kid? That wasn't put in the model when that kid's kept out of school for a year. It wasn't put in the model. What happens to someone who's, a conservative Christian who has a problem with alcohol and they're told you're no longer allowed to go to church and meet with these people when that is their sole source of kind of keeping this very weak thread of reality for them, of keeping them alive when that's taken from them. What happens to those people? What happens to the elderly, person who is alone in their apartment and no one's allowed to visit them for months and they're unwell? What happens to them? So there are all these things. None of those things are put into the models. The models are only looking at one thing. And part of it is the laptop class, quote unquote. These are who builds models, who's making the rules, Anthony Fauci and politicians and just your sort of general kind of suburban pediatrician or whomever else who is like on social media arguing with people, telling everyone, you better listen to the experts. Well, all of these people generally lead pretty comfortable lives from a material perspective. I guarantee if Anthony Fauci lived in a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx with 3 other people, and he had a son or a grandson who with autism who was reliant upon in-person physical therapy and other forms of physical intervention, somehow I have a feeling maybe he would have viewed lockdowns differently and school closures differently. And that's like, so all of these people who create the models and the rules for society, well, they were in a particular social and economic class that differs from most of America. And that's incredibly important when you think about what influences how policy is made. You had the virtuous, quote, good people who stayed home and could do their work on a computer and get their food delivered to them. While the bad people had to go out and earn a living and deliver them their food and work as a cashier and work in the, slaughterhouses and whatever else. So the pandemic was one of the most classist sort of policy events imaginable, where the wealthy, it's almost out of like a bizarre, medieval kind of fairy tale where you have the wealthy people are considered virtuous while they're at home entertaining themselves with their feet up on the ottoman, watching television and, doing their, Zoom meetings, while the poor, the poor losers are out serving them, bringing them their food and bringing them their delivering their packages and working in the warehouses. And they're the bad people. It was just quite an extraordinary thing that I don't think our society has sufficiently reckoned with this.
I would agree with that. I also would point out that one of the things you discuss in your book, which I won't belabor too much, but with sort of looking back on it is kind of humorous, is that the public was sold a model called the Swiss cheese model and told that was, I don't know, that you want to speak very briefly about what the Swiss cheese model was for people that may have forgotten?
Sure. So the Swiss cheese model was that if you imagine a slice of Swiss cheese, it has a bunch of holes in it. And they said, we need to implement a whole variety of interventions. Let's do 6 feet of distancing. We're going to do school closures. We're going to do mask mandates. We're going to do, don't gather too much. Maybe in a school, we're going to do these barriers on the desks and a whole bunch of other bullshit. But we're going to do all these things. And that if you picture little virions, trying to go through the holes, that hopefully maybe it goes through one slice of Swiss cheese, but it's going to bump into solid cheese in the next slice, or maybe it makes it through two slices, that if you do all these slices, that eventually, something's going to work. Now, what's fascinating about the Swiss cheese model of sort of science or public health is that it is an admission that they didn't know what worked. They were admitting out in the open, we don't know what works. Therefore, we have to do all of these things. Now, that's reasonable, perhaps, for a week or 2 weeks. It very quickly becomes unreasonable to continue to impose. Imagine if you went to the doctor and you had some sort of illness, and the doctor said, look, I'm not quite sure how to treat this, but I'm going to prescribe for you a dozen different medications. I want you to take each one of these dozen pills every single day. Many of them are going to cause you side effects. Some of those side effects are going to be extreme and they're really going to be harmful to you. But I want you to keep taking these 12 pills every single day for weeks and then months and months on end, because any one of them might be working and I'm not sure which one. So we got to do all of them. That's effectively what happened at a societal level with all of these mitigations that were imposed on us. And my analogy breaks down, however, where the pills weren't going to have the same side effects on everybody. And the people who bore some of the worst side effects of these, dozen pills, so to speak, that we were forced to take were children. And the irony, of course, Bryce, is that children were, by and large, at the absolute least risk of harm, yet by and large, they bore the worst of the side effects, the worst of the harms of these interventions. What kind of society imposes harm on its youth, on its children, in order to ostensibly, because it didn't actually protect them, but in order to theoretically protect the elderly? That is so upside down from how a typical just society would operate, where you value the youth, you value the kids. They're kids are the future. How extraordinary is it that they were forced to bear the sacrifice? The average kind of boomer 60-year-old who had plenty of money, maybe they were still working and they could do so from home. Maybe they were already retired. They're 65 or 70. Their life wasn't all that different. They weren't going to school every day with their peers. They already, they didn't have that much of a difference, but kids had to bear the burden for them and there was no benefit. And we can get into that, but the evidence is very clear that none of this, and it's very hard to stomach it, but all of this, and, in particular, the school closures had no benefit at all. It was only harm, no benefit. It wasn't even a trade-off, as people like to say, well, this is a worthwhile trade-off. It's worth it to save one life or whatever it is. It wasn't a trade-off. It was only harm.
To this point, and I think actually one of the things I wanted you to maybe clarify because I have found that it's difficult to have conversations about, retrospective conversations about lockdown policy in part because I think sometimes when I'm trying to talk about it, people we're sort of talking past each other because there's sort of a temporal, there's phases of the lockdowns. And I think you do a great job in the book of sort of stepping through, what was going on in February and March of 2020. And then, and I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you do say that it was reasonable to do some sort of like mitigation early on and have a closures of the schools that maybe like initially the 15 days to stop the spread. You say that perhaps it makes sense in retrospect to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt to try that. But what I think your book is that correct me if I'm wrong. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, by and large, I would say it was reasonable but wrong.
Right, reasonable but wrong in hindsight. But then I
Yeah.
think what your book does a great job of doing is showing how in real time scientific data had emerged to say this is a mistake, and yet they kept doing the same thing, making the same mistake. So, do you want to talk about? I guess there were different phases. I guess one is
Right.
the 15 days to stop the spread, and then there was when Deborah Birx extended it, right? I guess is she the one, like when was at the end of March, I think you talk about in your book?
Yeah, I think it was the end of March when they did the extension, which was a 30-day extension. So you didn't just, it was what, it wasn't just doubling the original, it was 2x or whatever, so you had 15 days. And then what was fascinating is there was almost, you can go back and look at the newspaper articles, there was virtually zero pushback or questioning by journalists about this. And this is, one of the big focuses of my book is on the media, and that people, wait a minute, we were told you need 15 days. And the reason you were slowing the spread was to prevent the hospitals from being overwhelmed. And they showed this graph, the flatten the curve or, meme, where if everyone stays home, if we do this stuff, instead of there being a spike in cases, it'll be, a smoother line, just a little hill. And that'll prevent the hospitals from being overwhelmed. And we were told that's the mission. Well, at the end of April, and I talk about this in the book, in real time, that was one of the things that really kind of unnerved me and frightened me, frankly, was toward the middle of April, cases in New York City had dropped off a cliff. That the 15-day, we did it. We slowed the spread. We achieved the goal. There was no longer, the trajectory was no longer showing that the hospitals were going to be overwhelmed. And that's what explicitly we were told was the purpose of these mitigations. And it didn't matter. The public health authorities just steamrolled right along and said, we need to do another 30 days. Where was anyone in the media saying, well, wait a minute, you told us the goal was to prevent the hospitals from being overwhelmed. Cases are now dropping precipitously. I mean, I think I show a graph in the book, but, I talk about the statistics at least. I mean, you could see in a graph, the cases just start going off a slope, like the downside of a mountain. It was very clear. And yet they kept doing it anyway. Why wasn't anyone asking, well, what are we doing here? What's the mission here? The mission changed in real time. And it's the cliche of moving the goalposts. And there was almost no pushback. And again, why is that? Well, who works at the New York Times? Who works at, Brown or Yale and these other, well, it's people who are in a sort of generally quite an elitist, prestigious, and comfortable position in life in American society. Well, for them, fuck it. Let's do another 30 days. Like, I don't want to risk anything. This is fine. Again, it's a very, very different circumstance for other people who weren't in that same socioeconomic bracket, who led very different lives. Even someone who ran a mom and pop business where they're like, we're devastated. We're making $0. What are we supposed to do? I can't I'm not a corporate attorney who can just get on my Zoom meeting and still collect, my fabulous income. And those people were told that they were complete assholes for wanting to go back to work and wanting society to try to run. Look, if you were worried about the virus, stay home. That's your decision. The problem was that this decision was imposed upon the rest of society, and in particular imposed on children, where they and their families, and I talk about this extensively, had no recourse. They had virtually no ability to influence the policy. They were shut out by the school administrators across the country. And I detail, a number of school districts where this happened. And I talk about my own school district, where it didn't matter what we said. It didn't matter what evidence was presented. They didn't care. They were not interested, because we said, look, we will fundraise so we can have tents, so everybody can have classrooms outside. This seems like a great idea. Everyone very early on knew that the virus wasn't likely to spread outdoors. Let's make it happen. Let's do outdoor school. And they came up with every excuse in the book. I mean, well, the kids might run away. That's a risk if we have it in a tent. I said, we can get parents or other people to be sort of guards and chaperones. They volunteered. They'll stand around the perimeter, make sure no kid wanders off or runs away. And then they said, well, but what about the kids who are home? We're not going to be able to live stream to them. I said, but the school had already ordered a bunch of hotspots, and is that called a hotspot? Whatever, where they could have had these things to broadcast from the field. Then we were even told, well, this is a fire hazard. We're not allowed to do this. I said, a fire hazard? It's outdoors. How could that even be? How could there be a fire hazard? I'll talk to the fire chief myself and see if we can get some sort of, variance for whatever rule you're citing. It didn't matter what evidence was given. There was always a reason. There was always an excuse to prevent the schools from reopening in any fashion.
One thing that doesn't necessarily make sense, at least at face value, what were the financial incentives that were behind some of these decisions? Because it does seem like, school closures would, in principle, have a negative effect on local economies. So, it is weird for or were there financial incentives that I guess are not as obvious?
There were a variety of incentives, and financial is one of them. I'd say one of the other incentives, let's be honest here, teachers were getting their salary regardless. It didn't matter. They weren't someone running a store or some sort of business that was getting devastated. They were getting paid. So for them, not all of them, and there were plenty of teachers who wanted to get back in the classroom, but the teachers' unions, by and large, were adamantly, vigorously opposed. And the message that we were given, in Randy Weingarten, after the fact, and Anthony Fauci, they all say, I always wanted schools to open. I just wanted it to be done safely. Well, that's the magic word. It's like, well, what is safe? And then you start digging in. It's like, oh, well, to open the school, quote, safely, you needed to have, the certain distancing. You needed to have HEPA filters. You needed to have this, that, and the other thing. Never any evidence that this stuff was going to have one iota of benefit. And I have a long section of the book on HEPA filters because I found it so fascinating that this was cited as a reason across the country. We can't open the school because we need a new HVAC system. None of these people have been to Europe. They don't use forced air with HEPA filters in Europe, by and large. It's very rare. They have old-fashioned, cast iron radiators and whatnot in the schools. They didn't have a HEPA-filtered oasis of air. In fact, they didn't even open their windows in many of those schools. They just had the kids in the building, no HEPA filter, no open windows. They just did it, and there was no observable negative consequence. Yet across the ocean in America, we were told month after month after month, long after those millions of kids were back in school in Europe, you can't open the school until there's HEPA filters there. So my point is that I don't blame the teachers' unions entirely. There's a lot of blame to go around. I view them more as opportunists. And the fact of the matter is, they openly admitted this themselves. Much of what they demanded in order for schools to open had absolutely nothing to do with pandemic safety. There's this extraordinary document from the Los Angeles Teachers Union where they had just this fantastical list of demands of they needed a special billionaires tax and a millionaires tax. We needed to defund the police. We need to, it was just a fever dream of a leftist, paradise of all sorts of things that had nothing to do with school safety. I think they even had something in their list of demands having to do with like no charter schools or something. It's like, what does that have to do with anything? They admitted, this is our chance. Here's our chance to like use our leverage to get everything we could ever dream of. It has not, and they took that ball and ran with it when the schools were closed, and they did not want to let those schools open without squeezing the districts and the communities that they were in for everything they could get out of them, or they were certainly going to try to do that. So, whether you want to call that financial or otherwise, there were certain incentives in place that created an absolutely devastating dynamic. And one of them is the teachers union. And then, beyond that is, I talk a lot about just this action bias. And you think about someone like Anthony Fauci and some others that for them, the incentive, they were never going to be held accountable for a kid who was a football player in his senior year of high school and was counting on that season in order to get recruited to get into college. And this was this kid's one ticket out of, perhaps a poor neighborhood. And I interviewed guys who did football coaching for these kids. This isn't some like made up scenario. This is real. Well, Anthony Fauci wasn't going to be graded on how that kid's life, his whole life trajectory is permanently altered. Didn't go to college. Maybe he dropped out of school entirely because he didn't do remote learning. Who knows where that kid is now? His entire life trajectory is changed. Well, that doesn't matter to Anthony Fauci. What he was being graded on was one thing only, which was what's happening with COVID cases and are they going up or are they going down? And it was almost, I liken it to sort of like being in a Las Vegas, sports betting room where you have these, screens with the different scorecards on there. Every day on the front page of the New York Times, and on their homepage online was this running counter of what are the cases and let's see what they are in different locations. Johns Hopkins had a heavily visited website where you tracked all these things. Nothing was tracking what is the rate of depression amongst children? What is the rate of suicide amongst elderly people who are left alone? What is the rate of missed cancer screenings? And on and on and on, and lost income. Then, by the way, lost income has a health consequence as well. None of those things were being measured and being discussed and featured within the news every day. So this kind of gets back to the models, Bryce, as well, that again, as a society, we were told we need to fixate on this one thing without looking at everything else over there. It was, don't look over there. Don't look at all that stuff. We can only look at this. And I spent a lot of time in the book digging into what is the precautionary principle and how in America, this was really, really kind of like a bastardized idea that we were told we were acting, quote, out of an abundance of caution, and that, well, this is the precautionary principle in action. And I explain in great detail, and I interviewed this wonderful scholar named Eric Winsberg, who he studies the precautionary principle, about why that actually wasn't what happened and wasn't what was put in place.
I did want to ask you, we were talking about incentives, and your book does a really nice job of talking about all types of weird things that happened and how certain, not just public health officials like Fauci and the teachers union, but also politicians, I guess, had incentives. And you mentioned something that happened in May of 2020 that I actually didn't remember. Maybe at the time I didn't, well, I guess I didn't, it didn't strike me as unusual at the time, but looking back on it is quite interesting, is this press conference that Andrew Cuomo held, where he then put up a slide about reimagining education. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it speaks to perhaps people in positions of power maybe exploiting the school closures or, taking advantage of them for some, personal or career gain.
And it's not only exploiting in a surreptitious manner, but very openly saying, this is a positive thing. Let's do turn lemons into lemonade. And Andrew Cuomo, who had been working with Eric Schmidt, who was, formerly at Google, and I think Bill Gates and some other tech people, that for them, this was amazing. I think Cuomo even said something like, he to the effect of, he said, like, why are we even bothering having school at all in a physical building? We can just do everything online. This is great. So for many, and I have a chapter where I walk people through the sort of history of technology in education. And what's kind of amazing is over and over throughout our history, and you go back to like Edison and some others where they were trying to have movies in school and all sorts of other things, that over and over we've been promised these benefits of technology. It's always sexy and exciting. Ooh, we've got movies. Now we have television. Now we have this, that, and the other thing, and the internet. And now it's, we have, the kids every kid in my school district has a Chromebook, and they spend, half their day on the Chromebook, and all of their homework is on the Chromebook, and all of their schooling is done through Google Classroom platform. You have all this stuff, and everything we're told, oh, this is amazing. This is the future. And over, the educators are too stupid to actually think through and see that, this is just yet another illusion of benefit. But everyone gets excited. We go, oh, we got to spend our money on the new tech toys. This is fun. And they come up with some fake sort of, evidence, if you can even call it evidence. Oh, this is going to help the kids with this. But none of these things ever bear out if you actually look at them in any kind of concrete fashion. And so all this is to say, Cuomo was very explicit and candid about his delight in the schools being closed. And because this ushered in, it just acted as a catalyst toward trying to push forth more of this remote learning, more dependence on digital and electronic technology, and less sort of in-person, physical, real-world, old-school education. So you have a lot of powerful people who are very, very happy and in favor of these sort of further infusion of technology into the education paradigm that kids were forced to follow. So for them, this was a wonderful opportunity. They weren't upset about it at all. And indeed, I had spoken with someone who had access at the very highest echelon of the Cuomo administration in New York. And I talked with him extensively, asking, what were you guys talking about with schools being closed? What was the evidence you were looking at? What happened when Europe reopened their schools? Tell me about like those meetings you had behind the scenes once all those millions of kids were back in school in Europe. Tell me about what happened, in the closed door rooms. And he said, well, we just didn't talk about it. It just didn't come up. Like this, it's not even like they were debating it and like, well, when should we open the schools? Should we or shouldn't we? It like just wasn't even discussed. This wasn't on their radar as something that mattered. They were happy to have them in remote learning. They didn't care. They didn't care.
One other thing I wanted to touch upon, we talked about the timeline of the lockdowns and the school closures. Do you think that there would have been a difference in policy decisions made if it wasn't an election year? I guess in the moving towards the fall of 2020, how much did the election or trying, if there were attempts to undermine Trump, contribute to, decisions that were made in the fall of 2020 relative to school closures?
I don't know how much the election year specifically, and it's, it's a counterfactual. I can't know how much an election year versus not impacted. But what we do know, and I give a lot of evidence behind this, this isn't just sort of like conjecture. We do know for a fact that much of the way that the Democratic establishment and then sort of more broadly the kind of elite establishment in our society, the sort of legacy media, public health leaders, and other people in that kind of upper echelon of American society, the kind of like thought leaders, tastemakers, and so on, that much of what they did was simply in reaction to Trump. That in July of 2020, Trump tweeted in all caps, something to the effect of, we must open schools in the fall, with a whole bunch of exclamation points. And as soon as he did that, all these people immediately, like a dog who reacts against pulling on their leash, they have to go in the opposite direction. These people immediately were like, well, if Trump says the schools need to open, that must be wrong. We have to go against it and keep them closed. That ironically, Trump championing schools being open ensured that they would remain closed in all of blue America. And one of the examples I give, and it's quite devastating, I believe, is that the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, very early on came out with basically a full-throated argument to get kids in school. And in an interview with one of the lead people on the AAP guidance, I think the interview was in the New York Times, one of the guys said, like, look, we don't need to worry about 6 feet of distancing. If it's 3 feet, good enough. He's like, we don't really have good evidence that 6 feet's going to, have any benefit at all. Or if it does, it's not worth the cost of keeping kids out of school. Let's just get them in there. This is the most important thing. It's going to be devastating for millions, tens of millions of healthy kids to be kept out of school long term. Well, immediately after Trump did that tweet saying we should open the schools, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out revised guidance. Gone was the idea of don't worry about 6 feet of distancing. Gone was the idea of no matter what, let's get kids into school. Instead, they said, listen to the experts. And they said, we need an enormous amount of money. That's how schools are going to be, only when it's safe. And interestingly, that second revised guidance by the AAP was co-authored by the 2 largest teachers unions in the country and the superintendents union, I believe. So there was nothing that happened, by the way, to be clear, in the interim from when the AAP's initial guidance came out and the revised guidance. There was no epidemiological shift that warranted them to change their guidance on schools. The only thing that happened was Donald Trump saying we should open the schools, and then the AAP reversed its guidance saying, boy, they need to be closed. I mean, there couldn't be a more stark example of how the health establishment and more broadly sort of like left-leaning America reacted and behaved.
So I guess that might answer the question, if I were to ask you who are the worst actors during this period of time, would sort of the teachers unions qualify amongst the worst actors?
I would put the AAP at the very top, perhaps, that there's just no limit to how just absolutely unscrupulous, anti-intellectual and dishonest the American Academy of Pediatrics conducted itself during the pandemic. Just an absolutely disgusting, disgraceful conduct. And I have in one of my extended footnotes, there's an example of there was a lawsuit in Texas where some families wanted to force, I believe, the Texas government to mandate masks, that the government in Texas said, we're not going to have mask mandates, or at least we're not going to compel every school district to have a mask mandate. It's going to be up to them. And these people said, you must have mask mandates. And the AAP did an amicus brief. It's like a friend of a court document in support of the people who were suing against Texas saying, you've got to have mask mandates. And part of their argument was that they said, people wearing masks is no worse than wearing sunglasses. And in a study, we can see that children can still pretty much tell what someone's emotions are when they're wearing sunglasses. Therefore, there's no harm in a 4-year-old being in the classroom with a masked teacher all day, because it's kind of similar to sunglasses and they can kind of sort of still tell what their emotions are, by only seeing half their face. So that's fine. I mean, it's the absolute debased lunacy of these people. It's hard to imagine. This is why I spent years writing this book, that it's not about the pandemic, but it's for people to look back on, because however much your audience may agree with me on these broader points, to actually learn about these insane details, these things that were happening that there was just so much going on that most people didn't know about. But to write an amicus brief where you're making an argument, about sunglasses with mask mandates. I mean, this is wild shit. This is craziness, that a sort of bizarre hysteria and very, very deep ideological tribalism took over the elites in our society, and they conducted themselves in an absolutely shameful fashion. And it's important to kind of see this about how is it that narratives are formed? How is it that decisions are made in a time of crisis and chaos? And that's what I try to show, is sort of what are the gears that turn behind society to enable something like this to happen.
Do you think anyone should face accountability?
I think, as far as accountability for this, it's hard to say that people did things that were outright illegal, and that's and so accountability as far as someone going to jail, might be a different question. I know we can set the whole, uh, you know, gain of function discussion aside. But the problem is that pretty much most of this was legal. That's the scary part. When someone breaks the law, that's much easier. It's like, oh, well, someone broke a law and they weren't, prosecuted. Well, no, much of this was just allowed. And moreover, much of society went along with it. So the scary part and the thing that we really need to study, because I think it is important to study what happened in the pandemic. I know most people want to forget about it. Oh my God, what was that like? That sucked for a few years. That was a bad time. Let's move on from that. Boy, remember that? That was crazy when we had to wear a mask when you enter a restaurant and then you took the mask off when you sat down at your table. Boy, that was stupid. We need to actually take a real serious look at how society, a lot of it collectively lost its mind and conducted itself, because it lets you see how bad things can happen when people behave irrationally and they simply go along with authority figures. That there was such a blind allegiance to authority by much of the country, particularly the sort of blue state, people who put their signs in their front yard. In this house, we believe in science. These people actually didn't believe in science. They believed in an argument from authority. They believed in, this person has the right credentials. I'm just going to listen to whatever they say, no matter how outlandish, no matter how much it conflicts with what I'm observing in reality. It doesn't matter. They're on my team. Those jackass, idiot Republican people, they're the bad people. I'm a good person. I'm virtuous. I'm good. And that was the dynamic that took place and led to stupid shit like wearing a mask in a restaurant and then taking it off when you sit at your table. I mean, this stuff is so farcical. It was absurd, and children sitting at a desk with a cardboard box around their head. And incidentally, you know what the kids did in order to talk to each other? They all leaned backwards and just spoke around the outside of the barriers anyway. None of this stuff was going to work. It was a joke. So it's important to actually study and see how is it that these kind of social dynamics can take place.
And I think your book does a great job of, giving, lesson after lesson of things that we should try to avoid next time. Although, are you at all optimistic that any of these, I guess, do you have a sense of optimism based on what at least you've seen, today, that we won't repeat what percentage of the mistakes that were made before do you see being, you see society, making again? Because I guess, to be fair, I'm actually quite pessimistic. I think that there's so much fracturing and divisions along political lines, and that rational decision making sort of goes out the window in times of chaos and crisis. So I am not optimistic, but perhaps do you have a different view?
I think, and it doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could just be some other emergency. And what I try to do with the book is say, look, the lessons here are not exclusive to what happens in the next pandemic. The lessons are about how does society act during any kind of crisis. And sure, I think there will be much, much more pushback against lengthy school closures, for example. But the fact of the matter is, any crisis, and or specifically a pandemic, it's going to be different than the last one. The disease that's the virus that's moving around will probably have different dynamics to it, and so on. So it's hard to draw a direct thing, but I think at least half the country will be far, far less agreeable to impositions being put on them. And I agree with you. So despite the fact that half the country will be less accepting of this, the other half, I think, will dig their heels in and will be just as foolish and stupid as they were the first time around. And we can give endless examples of how people are uncharitable in how they view the opposition, quote unquote, and how people are so certain of their rightness and their own kind, this sort of smug, sanctimonious kind of view on oneself. there is just this default of, I believe the experts. I'm going to go with them. I'm not going to listen to some internet rando or some journalist. I'm not going to listen to an economist. I listen to doctors. Well, doctors don't know everything. They aren't trained necessarily in the complexities of society and what happens when you impose these types of interventions. So unfortunately, I agree with you. I think most of the sort of maybe the mistakes themselves may look different, but the dynamics that allowed for those mistakes to happen will continue.
Yeah, okay. I guess sadly we're in agreement on that. But I guess at least with respect to how history remembers the decisions around the lockdowns, where do you think we stand now?
I think by and large, quote, sort of like normie people who aren't like super engaged in the issue, most people accept that things went too far. However, most of those people also, and in particular, people who are sort of like more hard left, people within the media and in public health would say, and I think touched on this at the beginning of our conversation, they did the best they could. There was so much we didn't know. They acted prudently. This was the precautionary principle. Sure, they shouldn't have kept the schools closed as long as they did, but you know what? We got to give them a pass. This was crazy. Trump was in office initially. We hate him. He's a bad guy, and like people were dying. You always throw that out, the people were dying thing, as if that, wipes everything clear. So unfortunately, the narrative that now persists is that, because initially it was, we have to keep schools closed. Then over time, then they said, okay, I guess we shouldn't have done that. But it was a reasonable decision at the time. And what's so important to me and why I wrote this book is to show that narrative is wrong. It's specious, it's misleading, it's dishonest. It's not true. That we did know at the time, we had evidence in real time, it was ignored and it was dismissed for a whole long list of bogus reasons. And it's unfortunate. It's hard to sort of, history is written by the winners. And we are such a bifurcated, such a acrimoniously divided society that a certain portion of people, it doesn't matter what evidence we give. They don't care. It won't matter. But what I hope with my book is that I've at least created a record, a historical document that people can look at later. And maybe it'll take a decade or 2 decades when people are a little more removed from the current kind of political environment, where they could look back and be like, wow, we really screwed up on that one. And I can see why. But right now, unfortunately, there's a certain segment of the population who will never accept that. Because I think that the moral injury from that is too large to accept that they actually caused great harm by the policies that they championed.
I would say it's one thing for people, members of the general population to sort of, stay, wed to that position. But it's another, and you talk about it in your book, like scientists in real time were refractory to clear scientific evidence that the policies they were championing were wrong.
Unfortunately, what I show in my book is that, and look, I come from a family of doctors and nurses and medical people, that unfortunately what I show is that many people within medicine and then more broadly within academia and the sciences are not actually intellectuals. They're not intellectually honest. They're sheep. They follow with the herd. And I talk about sort of self-selection. How do you become in these positions at university? You could speak to this better than I could, Bryce. Not all of them, but generally you don't become, you don't make your way and get accepted to a top university and then accepted into the PhD program and so on. You don't go to medical school and become a doctor by being an iconoclast. There are a few. But by and large, it self-selects for rule followers. It self-selects for people who go with the flow, who don't question the authorities, but flatter the authorities and reinforce what the authorities believe. And it's the same thing within the legacy media. You don't get to the New York Times by being someone who's really a contrarian. You get there by being someone who got straight A's in school, then you went to Brown, then maybe you went to Columbia Journalism School, and then maybe you did some great investigative work, but it was always going to be against the boogeymen, against big business, against the bad Republicans, against, the church, whatever it may be. It's quite rare that you're going to see the investigation against their own people, their own side, so to speak, really challenging the kind of accepted narratives and views of their own people. And that's one of the challenges about the pandemic, is that these sort of elite institutions from the legacy media and the public health establishment, they are not going to be inclined to start challenging their own side and their own behavior. So, you have a zillion books written about how, Bush and Cheney made mistakes and did horrible things with, the Iraq War and so on. You have, books about the church and, with the horrible things they've done. You have all these investigations of big business and so on. You're not inclined, you're not going to see it by most of these people where they're going to be questioning what they did. Because how did they get to be successful? Most of them, they got there by being part of the group, not by going against the group. It's part of a flaw, perhaps, and perhaps a small gift in my nature, that I don't mind being alienated or being kind of on the outside. I'd prefer for people to like me. I would prefer to be in a group of people, but I'm willing to tolerate not being included in that group. But that's perhaps a bizarre quirk of my personality, that most people, for sort of evolutionary purposes, they want to be accepted in the group, and they are disinclined to go against their peers, socially and professionally.
Well, maybe if you're up for it, perhaps you would consider taking a trip down to Rutgers University and giving a quasi lecture or sitting on a panel. I know you did a panel recently. Was it?
Yeah, Temple. Yeah, down in
Temple?
Philly. Yeah.
I think it would be useful because again, this book I do think is something that will be taught, or if it's, I don't think it's being taught yet because it just came out, but something that could be integrated into coursework on this subject for sure. So
I guess so. I'd love to come down for sure.
That would be fun, actually. Yeah. I would enjoy that. So I'm gonna just make sure I just say to people, please buy An Abundance of Caution. I really highly recommend David's book, and I appreciate David joining me to do a podcast. And I guess I'm going to spring something on you, David, because I'm going to end. And when I end, I have, outro music. And perhaps a lot of people don't know that you were a musician, and you were described, and I'll quote it, as a symphonic pop prodigy. You released a couple albums back in the day. Is there a song that you could recommend? I can't play it now, but I'll put it on when I edit this for the outro. Is there any that you'd recommend? I mean, I can select one, but if you got one in mind, let me know.
I'll let you select, Bryce. That's too much pressure.
Too much pressure? Okay, yeah. Sorry. But
How about, a good way to end is there's a song called Goodbye. So
you got one called Goodbye. Well, you'll see that when I edit this. But anyway, okay.
Very good.
Thank you very much, David. And like I said, please, everyone, take a look at his book and subscribe. Your Substack is Silent Lunch. Make sure to subscribe to David's Substack. And until next time, this has been Bryce Nichols on Science from the Fringe. Take care, everyone.